This week we're looking at housing culture, so there's a fair amount of overlap with settlement that we were talking about last week. Only we're going to take a slightly different tack and really look at the interior layouts and also the construction methods this week. So to overlap a little bit with what we were talking about last week with rural settlement, a lot of what we know about housing culture is because of settlement survival or lack thereof. The methods by which we know how peasants lived in the Middle Ages mainly comes through the form of these DMVs, which remember is deserted medieval village, not a place where you go to get your car sorted out. So when we look at the, well, hopefully above ground, but not always, we're kind of working on new techniques to try and get a better picture of, they're not technically subsurface features, but they're really hard to see with the naked eye. We can get a pretty good idea of like where buildings are. We can see that, but sometimes you can't tell very much detail. The ones that we've got the more detail for are usually the higher status buildings. So we're kind of left with whatever we can see on the ground a lot of the time for peasant housing, such as this is the aerial image of Warren Percy, probably the best studied deserted medieval village, and it is in England. So what we can see here in Warren Percy are the burgage plots or the crofts and tofts, which would have been where the houses here along the street front, and then the outbuildings and the thin strip of like garden plots out behind. Here's another deserted medieval village. This is another English one, slightly different plan, but you can see the building outlines much clearer, but not the same kind of burgage plot along thin plan. But at least we can see, okay, we can get an idea of the buildings. We can actually even see in some of them how they were split up too. So when we look for these house platforms, if they're not standing, we might be able to see them because the house platforms would often have been made out of stone, even if the building above might have been wattle and daub or out of timber. We do, as a result, because most of the time we're working only with these house platforms, there's been a lot of debate over what peasant, like low status peasant housing looked like. If you're really interested in that, I recommend Jane Grenville's stuff. But there's another limitation in that, you know, we're looking at these deserted medieval villages. These are nucleated settlements, like we talked about last week. We're still very, very little that we know about dispersed or isolated housing. Really, the only ones I can think of, and this is only in the last few years, they've managed to get pretty good archaeological excavation of transhuman housing from upland Ireland called booley huts. And these are very small, circular, made out of stone or made out of wattle and daub as well. So tend to be less complex than the ones that we're looking at in these deserted medieval villages. But once we look at these, they're pretty useful in that we can actually see it's not like all the buildings, all the houses are uniform in the Middle Ages. They're not. Here's Little Oxenden. You can actually see the field systems the most clearly here at Little Oxenden. But the village is slap bang there in the middle. So there's not a uniform type of house that peasants lived in. In Newtown Jerpoint in Ireland, which I also mentioned last week, a lot of the houses had multiple rooms, 2 rooms, large, rectangular, mud-walled house with 2 rooms, but there were other stone-built 2-story buildings as well with multiple rooms. So does size indicate status? That we're not sure about. So the typical larger house of Newtown Jerpoint in Ireland had an open hall at the ground floor, and then bedding spaces were there with storage above. In Warren Percy, again, this kind of long rectangular house, and again, a central hearth. Now this, as we're going to see very shortly, is a common pattern across all types of medieval houses. The larger rural medieval houses, now this is not one from Warren Percy, but it is at least one that is upstanding, that they've been able to make a decent plan of, and it does apply elsewhere too. So in ignoring the additions at the back there, It's the bit to the bottom that we're most interested in. So it reflects this, and I mentioned this last week, tripartite plan. 3 components to the larger vernacular housing. So the most important one is in the centre. That's the hall. That's the principal living room. And then a service end in a longhouse in very rural areas and earlier in the Middle Ages. This might be an area occupied by livestock, but it would also maybe later have been converted to domestic use. It would not have been a case where even when the longhouses were like, oh my God, they lived with their animals. Like, you know, it wasn't like they'd be sitting eating their dinner and a cow would wander in. No, I mean, it was formally separated from people by a cross passage. Here, this is actually even marked here, see, cross entry. So there's actually like a hallway separating the livestock from the hall, even in these ones. At the opposite end or the upper end, more private rooms. So this one actually does probably, it is likely to be an earlier plan, and then they've got principal parlour and parlour. This is reflecting higher social status, that there's more complexity in room functions. And you see these bits here at the front, take these to be large shop-facing windows, which I'll come back to. The hall, this bit in the middle, would have been single-storied. It would have been open to the roof. The windows in these houses would have been unglazed. They would have needed to have let the smoke out, even if they could afford to have glass. And we've talked about glass manufacture in an earlier class. But both ends could be storied. So the separate upper rooms would have been accessed by stairs or ladders. And usually at this point in class, I draw it for you and you all laugh at how bad I am at drawing a tripartite plan from the side. It would have been open roofed in a large part. This would have been possibly quite elaborate, carvings, etc., because it would have been visible. Your eye would have been drawn up. Otherwise, interiors, you know, we talked about daily life fairly recently, quite plain. They weren't junk lovers like us today. Now, this house is likely belonging to a wealthier family. No, not necessarily noble, but wealthier, because they've got more specialised rooms here. They've got multiple parlours. There's no kitchen marked here, which indicates they must have had a separate kitchen. They don't have a chapel. That probably would have been somewhere prominent if they did have one of those. The plan is really quite linear, as you can see, very rectangular, and the 3 main elements are sharing a single roof. But the hall would have been centre, and it would have had only been 1 story, and that's because of the hearth, okay? So look at this picture on the right, and you can see why. Fireplaces are a very late addition. If we see a fireplace in a medieval building, we know that a couple of things happen. Number 1, it's not medieval. It's well, maybe very late medieval, but if I'm surveying a building and I see a fireplace, I'm immediately going to start thinking that it's going to be 15th century at the earliest, or very common too is that it's a later insertion, that they have added a fireplace later. So actually fireplaces are a way to date buildings in ways that otherwise we would not have. It's very hard to date these buildings. You might think, wow, wouldn't that have been very smoky? Yeah, it would have. There's been some interesting studies into the effects of having open hearth, and although you can see in this Crook plan how it would have been open above and they wouldn't have had glazed windows, they would have had shutters instead. There was still a lot of evidence for lung and eye diseases in medieval populations because their whole lives are revolving around a hearth inside. So the hall and the hearth is in the centre of the hall. This is the centre of medieval homes, both vernacular and elite. This is a commonality across the board. A high status peasant would have had a hall. The smallest cottages would not have had a hall, but they still would have had a central hearth, which would have been the central place in the building. These early or lower status homes would have been very small, single roomed, overlap with a barn, might not have had a byre for the animals. across the board. Likely their floors were made out of clay because they could be often replaced. Only the very best homes would have had tiles. But we can often see that they had mats to cover the floor, so we can see the imprints if we excavate on the clay floors. And you can see where the furniture often was, because they're much more simple in terms of furniture, and they would have really been investment pieces and therefore wouldn't have been moved very much. We can spot some early medieval houses in that they really do look like barns. You might be looking at this crock construction on the right here and being like, yeah, that does look a bit like a barn. They're aisled like a church, so they can look pretty much like a church or a barn. So they tend to have very vast halls with very small ends. So the hall is big, and then I suppose a trend, and this is a generality, but a trend being that these end parts become more dominant. So a lot, because of the centrality of the hall, a lot of scholars have emphasized how public medieval houses were. Now, this is open to debate, and I'm going to have you discuss this in your open poll question in the Nearpod shortly. The reason behind so many scholars saying this is because there's really one large room, and it had multiple social functions. The servants would have lived and slept in the same space as the lords, and so the argument goes that this changes later in the Middle Ages, that the whole emphasis changes in the 14th century, when we find more of these end spaces being more enlarged, having their own specific functions. Therefore, it's been suggested maybe the 14th century is where we begin to see the start of a privacy trend. By the 17th century, the halls disappears because it's become the kitchen. The kitchen exists instead of the hall. Now, why the hall? Why are we talking so much about the hall in this week when we're talking about housing? Well, hall is central because hospitality is central to a medieval identity. It's not just their house, it's like their entire social identity. This is best seen at a lordly level in the feasting. This was part and parcel of what it meant to be a lord, but even at the lower levels of society, sort of communal eating was very common. If you were a peasant, might have focused on the church, but certainly feeding other people was an identity thing in the Middle Ages. So a lot of academic attention has focused on identifying physically where entertaining spaces were in medieval buildings and what this might be. So they might be like, okay, well, what arrangements do people have? How many people could they have over for a feast? What type of meals were presented? And, you know, for the types of meals, we can see that when we looked at the Ménagier de Paris recently, he's really talking about how to feed people. So he sees it as part of his identity. And of course, where are you going to conduct the feasting? In the hall. There's been some really interesting work done by Gillian Scott. She's also known as Gillian Eady, and she's looked at castle spaces and she worked from the basis of how tables, how furniture would have been constructed in the Middle Ages, and got the dimensions of like benches, chairs, tables, the raised dice, for the lord, and then she like went and superimposed these arrangements on different identified hall spaces, and from that she was able to work out like how many people you could have in these halls. And you know, it really, even though the sizes are very similar, the orientation matters, whether there's pillars matter, so it can be really quite, you know, intimate in that, you know, you could be your family and your closest friends, or you could have, you know, everybody fitting in. So it's a really interesting area of studying. So the hall is taken as the central indicator of how houses and castles and manors, how they operated in medieval society. They're the location where public and private meet. Because, as I mentioned last week, it's also where the law courts would have been on the manors, where the peasants would have gone to pay their rent, etc. There's also, of course, a lot of focus on the whole, but we do need to remember, as I mentioned last week, that there's a complex involved. The whole is important, but there could have been a courtyard with other building functionality. So we can't just be like, oh, they use the whole for everything, because there could be other buildings in the whole complex. But the Hall is going to be one of the easiest buildings to identify because it's nice and big and square. They also, because they're important, they tend to be better constructed than other less important buildings because they need to reflect status. We know medieval people use material culture to show off status. And so they will have been the constant focus of improvements, of continued use, of making sure they're in tip-top shape. So this might mean that earlier halls are hard to identify because they might be a building that was constantly in use for many, many generations and they just made repairs when needed. Halls, you know, the building materials could be stone, but a lot of them will be made out of timber because we need to remember that we tend to look at stone and be like, ooh, fancy. But medieval people were really impressed by high quality timber as well. So even a timber hall might have been a very imposing and dominating building. We tend to find a lot of them through archaeology. You're going to be reading this week that it's kind of hard to find a lot of these standing. There are some, but not in all countries. In Ireland, we don't have any. England is a lot better. So we tend to look for post holes and beam holes. And then that's really hard to tell like what's going on because you're not going to get any indication of like function and use in higher floors. Yeah, are people sleeping above? You don't know because there's no archaeological remains for the higher levels. Other things we'll find associated with a hall, if we find the hearth, then we know, oh great, we've got the hall. And of course, if the hearth has been used over a long time, you're going to find a lot of burnt and charred remains there. We might also expect to find a garderobe, and a garderobe is a fancy word for a toilet. Because you're living there, you're feasting there, you need a handy bathroom. And we might also find the kitchen and service rooms nearby, if not in the same building. We could find as well, if they excavate, some really fancy roof tiles, and that's been taken to indicate in some places that this was the hall because the smoke rising up from the hearth will have drawn the eyes upward, and so if you're going to show off, you're going to put some investment in where the smoke escapes. And one of the places, and I have a picture of it, and darn if I could find it. It must be back in my office in lockdown. But there's a high medieval Motte and Bailey site called Goltho, and they found the hole there and they excavated it, and they found very fancy roof tiles, very heavy. They kind of look a bit like, they're not dragons, but they remind me of dragons. So it showed that they had a very intricate arrangement made out of tile at the roof level. And they also, if you imagine either of these plans in front of you, they probably would have painted the beams, and we have evidence for them being painted with red ochre. So a red color was very popular, but artwork as well. They would have left the beams exposed. If they cover it up, that tends to have been something that was done in the post-medieval era. Okay, so our hall may have been lived in too as well. But obviously the sleeping chambers might be above. And so we need a full standing building for identification. Since we might also look for a private space above the halls, like a roof area or a balcony area above the hall might have been a private space for the owner, for the lord, and access. If we look at the access arrangements, is it only going through to a particular room, then that might be the lord's chamber. So if we look at the picture on the left here, you're going to see there's a jetty marked here, these protruding areas. So those were handy to overhang even the whole area. So if we find smaller rooms, we might start, and a multiplicity of smaller rooms, and we might start describing different functions to them. And we want to find these in higher status buildings. So for example, if we're in a big castle and we find smaller rooms, particularly maybe if they're in a central place defensively, like over the entranceway, that might be the constable's private rooms. And the constable was the man in charge of running the castle. Or it might be guest lodgings. In a lot of the high status buildings we find quite nice guest lodgings. And those might have been in towers. Handy place for them, out of the way, not in the middle of things. Yeah, you know, if you've got a guest room, it's not going to be the best room in the house and might be slightly out of the way to give you and some privacy. So it has been suggested that, and when we're dealing with very large complex housing, like castles, that the king and the lord, his family and important guests were inside, in the most inner parts of the building, and then the garrison, the servants, and the less important guests were further away in the outer area, so that there's kind of this notion of centre and periphery in terms of the layout. Students always are interested in dungeons and prisons and castles, and yeah, they're not going to see any of these in timber frame buildings, but there tends to be over-enthusiasm for identifying these features in high status medieval buildings. They're probably mainly storage rooms, okay? You need dank, dark storage rooms for, you know, your casks of wine and grain and stuff, and your valuables to take care of them. So a lot of these, oh, here's a dungeon, you're like, oh no, that's a storage room, people don't. Okay, so there are lots of different building materials. Now, we did discuss this briefly last week. You're going to read more about it in your readings this week. There could be some variety. I'm going to come to timber buildings shortly because a lot were made out of timber. We can imagine stone very vividly, but there are other methods that they use. So this is a picture of a church made out of flint. So flint is, you know, the same as you're thinking of like prehistoric man making his arrowheads out of. That's exactly the same. Only these are the great big lumps of it, and then they will have had lime mortar in between. So this building here has been completely constructed out of this with sandstone dressings. This is a style called checkerboard, and I'm sure you can work out why that is. And it is not that common in vernacular buildings, but it crops up. It seems to have been a fairly popular style, and I'm sure you can start thinking about why you might build this way, because it's pretty striking, isn't it? This is a building I've been lucky enough to visit myself. It's called the Marley Pins. It's from a medieval port town in the south of England. It is a vernacular building. Now, the roof line is not original, but it's been mucked with, and you can see that the street level is higher than it used to be as well. But this looks to have been a commercial building, so possibly residential as well, but definitely vernacular. So it's not a simple case of, oh, vernacular houses could be really quite plain. They could be pretty fancy as well. But of course, to overlap with our timber buildings from last class, the majority of vernacular housing use timber construction. And as I said last time, they're always prefabricated. They're kind of they are jointed together and then pegged. So you don't find that many nails in them, actually. They're trying to slot them together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. It's a year between them felling the trees and putting the building up. They're trying to use green wood because it's easier to work with in this method. They would spend only 1 or 2 days what they called raising the frame. So to flick back to this picture, there's the frame on the left with the terminology. So they spend a couple of days throwing this together, almost like prefabricated. Then they take longer to add the roof, which would have been thatched most likely. And then they would add anything that needed wattle and daub. So that's going to be the bits in between the wood. The videos that I've posted for you from YouTube is going to explain these techniques for you. The only thing I'll add actually to those videos, the one thing they don't discuss, and I saw this when I was at grad school and we went on field work, and they were renovating a timber building, and they were updating the wattle and daub. And inside the timber frame, inside the box frame, they found lots of sheep's wool. And so what it looked like was they were using sheep's wool as insulation, you know, the way we would put insulation in our walls to keep it warm. They were using sheep's wool. So we don't find that actually often talked about in things that I've read or videos or anything like that, but I saw it myself. So I know that they did do that as a form of insulation. As I mentioned, about 60% of timber buildings and towns had a shop front. So in the Middle Ages, I think it's very difficult to separate, and I've argued this as well in writing, that it's difficult to separate the commercial from housing. That's another sort of dichotomy or not in this public-private discussion. As I mentioned last class, can we use timber to tell wealth? Is it that there's more timber, that means they're wealthier? Certainly jetties, and this picture here on the right, they've got a little jetty. It's a more complex building procedure, probably does show more wealth, more investment in the building. Crosswings as well. So more complex designs, we presume, indicates more wealth. If it survived, as I mentioned last class, if you built your prefabricated kind of structure with green wood and it survived 5 years, it was going to stand solidly for centuries. The collapse comes when it kind of warps the wrong way. And this is how we can often tell the different construction periods and renovation periods in medieval timber frame buildings. Later on, they tend to use mature wood because they need something that's of a concrete and discernible size to make repairs. And if you're using mature wood, you really need to hammer it in. So if you see lovely smooth parts, which were the green wood that has kind of melded itself into place, and then bits of wood that show lots of hammer marks and chipping marks, well, then that's going to be a later, repair job. The other thing the cool thing about, the timber buildings that are standing is that we can get a good date for them. We can date them using dendrochronology. Dendrochronology is tree ring dating. So in case, most students are familiar with this already, but just in case you're not, it's when you look at, you cut a tree sort of horizontally across and you look at the rings, you see that they're all different widths. And so this is to do with the fact that the trees will grow at different rates each year, and each ring is a year. And they grow at different rates depending on, climate and weather and lots of different things. And scholars who are trained in this have like a baseline where they can compare your sample to their pre-existing baselines, and by comparing the two, work out a date for the sample you gave them. So that is tree ring dating. So they can then get usually oftentimes pretty accurate. I mean, I've seen it like in a range of like 10 years, which is pretty cool for the Middle Ages. And then that's a really useful tool for us trying to date these buildings. So to move on to what you've got to do next after watching this video, I'd like you to consider, when you're going through the materials, this debate over private versus public. This is a big argument in the study of housing. They are personal and family residences, but they have lots of other things going on. Charles Coulson, who's written a lot about medieval buildings and architecture, describes medieval houses as having a dual personality. That's how he deals with it. So I've got two readings for you. One of them is the English Heritage Guide, which will also be of interest to the HP students as it goes on, because it talks about preservation and how to have how the legislation applies and stuff. And there's also a blog from Dr. Duncan Berryman, who is a specialist in medieval buildings, and he just posted today. I mean, I'm speaking to you from the past, of course, but he just posted today about social distancing in vernacular housing in the Middle Ages and comparing it to COVID-19. So I was like, well, that is excellent timing, because I always love to see things that intelligently and accurately convey the importance of the Middle Ages to today. So you can read that blog post, but also have a plunder around his blogs anyway. This is his area of research. So if you're trying to find more information about public-private, he's going to be a good place to start as well. If you don't know any of the terms, I know there's lots of terminology. The Oxford English Dictionary is my go-to. Don't bother with Merriam-Webster. Too modern. The Oxford English Dictionary will give you the history of terms, so it's good for medieval terms, whereas Merriam-Webster really falls short there. So go to the OAD, and I provided the link again. We get it through the library. You use it through the library, they keep on buying it for us. And then I've got a couple of video clips about construction methods. One of them is wattle and daub, and the other one is about thatching for an earlier house. And then I've got a question for you to answer, and then it's the flip grid. And I'd just like for you to discuss this week. I'm particularly interested, since many of your HP students, I'm really interested to hear what you make of the preservation recommendations that's made by English Heritage, and also the building techniques, and how this stacks up to what you know about pre-modern American examples. I'm very interested in hearing that. Okay, good luck.